Okay, welcome this morning, everybody. I'm here. My name's Darren Nimke. Jonathan Ruckett, who presented yesterday, is down in the front row. Yesterday I was in the front row heckling him. Today we've reversed the roles. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about Entity Framework 7 with you. Just a bit of background on me. In the dim distant past, I was an MVP for ASP.NET and Windows Live. I worked for a company called Redify in the early stages and left when they were about 40 people. I understand they're about 200, and every second person I see here seems to be from Redify, so they've obviously had a lot of success after I left there. After that, I sort of went out of development for a long time and got into management roles, into project management roles, recently as a chief operating officer for a startup in healthcare, but have recently come back to software, which I'll talk more about in just a moment. I also coach hockey in my spare time. I recently coached the South Australian Suns women's hockey team in Sydney, and so I do a fair bit of hockey coaching. So that's a bit of an aside, but a bit more about me personally. So yeah, getting back into software development was quite a deliberate decision. I was enjoying the management world, but I was also keeping an eye on the technologies and the vNext version of .NET and what the ASP.NET team are doing. And I could see that it was a fundamental shift. There's been a fundamental shift in terms of things like open source and GitHub and Git, and the developer toolkit's changed a lot over the last few years, as I'm sure you will all agree. And it's a good time to be in this ecosystem and learning this stuff, but I think it's also, for me, it was an important time to come back and reacquaint myself with some of the tools, because I think that the vNext version and open source community are a fundamental shift, and it's an important shift. And I know we all make decisions about where we invest our important time, but I think for me this was an important one and a good opportunity to come back and work on a production application that was using these technologies. I think my experiences, I guess today I'm really here to share my experiences and my learnings with you about Entity Framework 7 in particular. For me, Entity Framework 7 is a really important toolkit in the developer tool belt, because data access is something that we all have to do in every app that we do, and the easier that can be, the more unobtrusive that can be, but the more powerful it can be and expressive it can be when we need it through either APIs or link, then the better that is. And my findings, I think there's an important ITI in software that's not often talked about. We talk about maintainability and scalability, but I don't think we talk enough about enjoyability. And one of the important things, like why I got into Angular development or why I get into specific technologies, is because I actually enjoy doing it. Meaning that it's a technology that I'll crack out in my spare time because I know that I can be productive in it. I can go home, I can sit down at the dinner table, and I can build a web page that's a calculator in Angular in minutes. And my findings in terms of Entity Framework 7 are that the enjoyability factor is quite high, meaning that I can crack open a new project, I can build a project that talks to a database, or I can write unit tests against my database really quickly. And so the important ITI for me is enjoyability, and that's a high one. So I think that's a good enough introduction. I'm going to read from my notes because I'm someone that needs to refer back to my thinking. The goals of the session. So we're going to take a fairly broad walk through Entity Framework 7 and look at what it means to get it into a project and get up and running with it. I want to go through some of the key scenarios of what it means to use Entity Framework, so that when we leave the room, we've got a broad understanding of the different types of scenarios, whether that's development time, whether it's build time, whether it's test time, or deployment time. And to do that, I'm going to have essentially 4 key demos that we'll walk through. So first of all, we'll look at how do we get a new project up and running, get Entity Framework bootstrapped into it, and talk to a database. So how easy is that to do? Then we'll look at some of the query engine, some of the logic around queries, what Entity Framework does when it's executing queries, just to see what they're doing with performance, what's changed and what's remained the same. After that, we'll look at some of the important scenarios around migrations, which are important because they affect the life cycle of your application through not just development time or production time, but right through the cycle of test and build as well. So just some important things around there around creating migrations, maintaining them, seeding data for different environments, and how we can get inside the Entity Framework to make that stuff work for us. And then finally, and the stuff that's really made me happy is just to show how easy and how testable they've made it by introducing a new in-memory provider. So the first thing I'd like to do is to give the high-level 40,000 foot view of the vNext ecosystem. There's been a lot said both in John's talk and in other talks about the why of vNext, but I'll just touch briefly on that as well. I think vNext is something that Microsoft had to do. It wasn't an optional thing for them. If you think about the .NET framework, it's now 15 years old and it's built up a lot of legacy. So we're still paying for the button class that shipped with web forms. You know, we're still pulling down the JavaScript and the images that went into the web part framework and zones, whether we're using them or not. And each of those adds to the size of the DLLs that we have to deploy. And each of them carries with them the legacy dependencies that they were built with. Each of them carries the maintainability cost, and that reduces agility of Microsoft to deploy. So what they've done is to take a look at the .NET framework, and they've componentized it and broken it down now into a take what you need approach, which we'll see in a moment with Entity Framework, that you know, if we just want to talk to SQL, then we just need two small packages. You know, we don't need web parts and zones. We don't need the button class. So this is going to be important today, but more importantly, you know, in 5 years' time, when they want to switch something out, we're just talking about one package. And so people can then have a choice about, you know, do they take the new package, do they take the new SQL provider, or do they stay with the old NuGet package? So it gives more agility to Microsoft, but it empowers us more to use the components that we want when we want them. So the vNext ecosystem, as again has been talked about, is based in GitHub, which is great. Again, I'm really enjoying the community feel of going. It feels to me like it felt in 2000 when we were collaborating on .NET and people were just sharing everything. You know, someone would create a date time class and they'd work out how to format a date and they'd post it to a news group and you'd go, wow, I learnt something. And it's back to that again. So I'll just bring up the Entity Framework site. So this is where Entity Framework lives in GitHub. This is the repository. We've got the source folder, the tests, so you can go through and have a look at the source code. You can see how they test it. So all the different packages within the source code, the core framework, which has the DB context and the annotations and the Entity Framework itself, the commands, which we'll look at more a bit later. So you can go and see how they were built. You can go and see how they were tested. You can read design notes. So if I go back to Entity Framework repository, there's the wiki link. And we can go in there and have a look at design meeting notes. Often they'll talk about upcoming design decisions. You know, the architects will say, we're thinking of doing this. They'll get feedback on it. So you can be part of and participate in how Entity Framework's being built. You can subscribe to the issues list and get these little notifications each morning and have a look at, you know, what's happening. You know, there's a failing SQLite test, so you know that they're working on the SQLite provider. At the moment, you know, they're working on the SQL provider, the SQLite provider. They'll work on the other Azure and Redis providers post-go live. But again, you can have a look at all the discussions, the issues, why they're issues, and learn a lot more. It's this learning environment of the community again, which I haven't personally felt since the initial release of .NET, but it feels that way to me again. Sorry, I keep popping down there, but that's how I have to navigate. So I spoke a little bit about this, what is EF7, the why of it, it's a componentized, it's a from the ground rewrite. And that's that's a new rewrite as in file, new solution. It was done that way to run on .NET Core, and also, as I said, to break the legacy of this monolithic entity framework DLL that was very hard to refactor and carried a lot of legacy decisions. And that has brought with it a more modular design. On the GitHub site, you can see the milestone release dates. So currently we're in beta 8, heading into RC1. RC1 will carry a go-live license. It'll be supported for production apps. And then we're looking at probably a late Q1 ship, hopefully, for the final release. I'll just go back one slide. So when I say we're on beta 8, that's the version that the Entity Framework team are pushing onto their NuGet source. But over on MyGet, which is a separate package source, they're also hosting two sources. One is for sort of a semi-regular update of RC1 builds, and another one, which Jonathan found out last night, hosts their nightly build or their continuous integration build. So whenever they push that, we get a new package, and that could happen to us at any moment. So yeah, we're consuming sort of the nightly builds, which means we have to react a bit more often, but it means we don't get that big change from beta 8 to RC1 to RC2. Okay, so there's a bunch of stuff. This is a list that I got from the product manager of Entity Framework. He presented it last week at an internal meeting. There's a bunch of things that aren't in the first release, and these could be showstoppers for you. And it's the reason why Microsoft say, we're not saying you should migrate to Entity Framework 7 today, because not all the feature set is there. The important things for me is that you can't reverse engineer a database to create a model. And the non-relational providers haven't been worked on, as I mentioned. But they're on the backlog, you can see it on the backlog, and they will be the first thing the team works on post-go live at the end of Q1 next year. At the moment, they're obviously very focused with the ASP team and all the other teams to hit this V1 release date, and it's a very tight timeline for them, so they're not over-committing on what they're going to deliver. As I said, and this is, again, guidance from Microsoft themselves, when would you use EF7? Understand the limitations, and if you're okay with that, then for sure take it on. But clearly, if you're not talking to SQL Server or SQLite, then EF7 probably isn't for you, unless you're happy to write a provider. If you don't target the full .NET stack, then maybe EF7 is a good choice for you, because moving forward, that'll be the platform that you'll be developing on. But as I said, Microsoft is not recommending that today you all go back after this talk, go into your office, take your EF6 code and migrate it. That's not what they're about. So, first demo. I want to show just what's involved in terms of getting a new project up and running, getting Entity Framework in it, and then talking to a database. So we'll open Visual Studio. We'll go File, New Project, and we're going into the web set of templates, because that's where the VNext templates live, and we'll pick Console Application. You just keep nodding at me when I'm doing the right thing here, John. I get a lot of confidence from that. Okay, so we've got our new console application here. The first thing I like to do is to open a console window and type dnvm list. So this is the command that John showed in his talk yesterday, the .NET version manager, and it shows what versions of vNext or .NET I have on my computer, I have installed. And so this one shows that I've got lots of versions of the framework installed, but that I've also got the latest version is RC2 16183, targeting the CLR on x64, and that the asterisk next to that denotes that that's the one I've selected as my default package or my default version on this machine. So the first thing I'm going to do in my project is make sure that my project is configured to build against that version of the runtime. I can target other versions, but for development purposes, I'm going to target that my new application will compile against RC2 16183. So I go into global, and just change the version of the STK. 183. When I save that, that will update that, and this project will now build against that version. The next thing I want to do is to go into my NuGet config and add a package source so that I'm pulling libraries from the nightly build that I showed on my get. Okay, so that when I reference EF7 package in a moment, that it's going to pull it from that package source and not from somewhere else. So it's just restored those packages and I'm all good, so that's a better start than Jonathan had yesterday. Next thing to do is to come into my project JSON, and I'm going to add the dependencies for Entity Framework. So I won't risk typing these out because I'm sure that I'll be a bad typer when I'm nervous and standing up here, but I'll just drag them in. It's quite a simple list for the application that we're building. We're bringing in the Entity Framework core package, which, as I said, will give us the DB context, it'll give us data annotations, it'll give us the basic entities and plumbing for Entity Framework. I'm bringing in Entity Framework commands because that's a set of commands that help me build migrations and deploy them to the database and update the database, so we need that while we're developing. And I'm going to bring in the Microsoft SQL Server provider package, and so that denotes that I want to talk to SQL Server. If I was going to talk to SQLite, then I'd bring in the SQLite provider. If I was going to use the in-memory provider, then I'd bring in the in-memory package. So 3 simple dependencies. And because I've brought in the commands, I want to type out a new command that I will get DNX to run for me called EF, and that will point at framework.commands. So I'm just adding that to the list of commands that I can now get DNX to run for me. And now that I've got that there, what I want to do is to go out to a command window and try and run that command. And if Entity Framework's set up, we should get the unicorn screen. Okay, so we've said to DNX, go into that project and run the EF command, which runs Entity Framework.commands package that we installed, and that's what it's run by default. And you can see there are a list of commands that are now available to run through DNX EF. Okay, so good news is we've got Entity Framework in our project. So what I'll do next is I'm just going to create some entities. So I'll just create a coffee class. Again, I've got some pre-canned code here so that you don't have to watch me typing. So that's my basic entity. That's what I'm going to be able to query in my application and use in my application logic. Next, I want to create a database context, same as what we would have done with previous versions of Entity Framework. And again, no difference here. We just need to create a DB set. And that helps Entity Framework configure a table to represent that entity set. and I just bring in using data entity. Next thing I want to do is to, on my coffee entity, so Entity Framework's the same as the previous versions in that it's convention-based. So if I'd given coffee class an ID of ID, Entity Framework would just know that that was a primary key, and it would generate all of the Fluent structure underneath that to go and create an ID key that's a primary key in the database. Because I've given mine a different name, I just need to use some of the Fluent API to configure that and tell Entity Framework where to find the key. Override. Probably helps if I inherit from DB context. So in on-model creating, again, this is the same as Entity Framework 6 code largely. We just want to configure the model builder to say, when you find the coffee entity, you'll find the key as the coffee_ID property. And Entity Framework now knows that that's the primary key. I'm also going to override on configuring and just use world's worst practices here by bringing in a SQL connection string and telling it where my database is. So normally, obviously, we'd put this out in configuration, but for the purpose of this demo and keeping it simple, I'll just put that in the onConfiguring method there. Okay. Just get rid of that database. Okay, next thing we want to do is to create our migrations. So again, we'll go out to the command line and use Entity Framework commands here. Sorry, I'm clicking around a bit. I hope it's not too hard to look at, but I'm obviously a little bit nervous standing up here. So DNX EF migrations command, add, and we'll just create a migration called initial. Maybe I didn't save that. So I've saved that. It's now found the connection string which it needs, and then it's gone and created in our application a set of migrations in the migrations folder. And so again, that's configurable. You can change which project it generates them in. You can change the folder name. You can change the naming structure, and so forth. So I'm just going to recreate that coffee shop database, just so that we've got an empty one. And then come back into our application, go to program, and we want to run some code. So I'll bring in some helper methods here and just explain those. Coffee context, database. Not quite sure. Can you see what I've done wrong there, Jonathan?
Yeah, you created some extra objects. Just scroll down. Go right.
I don't know quite why I created that, but I apologise for this. Right. Ah, yes. we've still got that. Okay, that's better. Thank you for your help. Okay, so I'm using some helper objects here off of the database context. We can get the database property, and there's just a couple of helpful extension methods, ensure deleted and ensure created. And that will, it's kind of like the Entity Framework version that says drop always when you run, but they've just kind of broken it down to be a bit more granular. I'll run ensure deleted and ensure created just to make sure we get a fresh database. I also want to just seed some data to begin with, just so we've got something to query against. Inaccessible. Public coffee. That should help. Okay, so we can now see that. Namespace cannot contain members. I apologise for this, guys. Again, it's just nerves. Okay. I'll run console.read line here just so that we stop in the program, but you can see if I mouse over read key, you'll see that it's unavailable. Again, this is a .NET version thing. It's because I've got my application configured to compile against .NET 4.5.1 and .NET Core, and read key is not available in .NET Core. So just to get around that for now, we'll just say read line, run our application. So we should ensure that the database exists. We're going to seed some data. Probably should have written something out, but we'll just go and check that that has, in fact, created our database. We've got our coffee table, and if we select the rows, we can see that we've inserted those records. So other than all of my fiddling around in Visual Studio in front of you people, what did we do? We brought in 3 references: Entity Framework Core, Entity Framework Commands, and Entity Framework SQL Server. We configured the database context to know which SQL Server to look at. We ran ensure deleted, ensure created, and we seeded some data. So if you took my 5 minutes of fumbling around out of the way, it's probably 5 minutes and you're up and running and talking to SQL Server, and now you're on your way to creating entities. Okay, so now that we've got our database and we're configured, we've seen that we've got some choices about what providers we want to use, what versions of the runtime we're going to target. There's some knowledge of the tooling like DNX and the Entity Framework commands, so I've shown that. But it's still a familiar programming model, so we've still got entities, we've still got the Fluent API, we've still got data annotations, we've still got data context. So the programming model is all still very familiar, but there's been some tweaks to it. And we'll have a look in the as we start to use Entity Framework. What I want to show next is just what some of those changes are. So the next demo that I'll show is just where we'll go and run some queries now against our SQL Server database, just to show what Entity Framework's doing under the hood. Okay, so what I've got here is just an extension of the application that we created before. I've created some entities in my models. It's just a simple store, trading day, customer order. So it's a model there, and in my program now I'm just going to run some separate queries, and we'll have a look in SQL Profiler to see what gets spat out. So the first thing I'm going to have to do is to run my migrations. So I'll just create a new blank database. Coffee shop. And I'm going to come into Explorer here and blow away my existing migrations. Go out to the command line and we'll run dnx ef migrations add initial. Okay, so we've got our migrations there. So if we go back to our demo now, the first query that I'm going to show we're going to run is from SQL query. And what we've got here is off of the database context, I'm getting the coffee entity and I'm using the from SQL extension method and I'm going to run some arbitrary SQL. Of course, we would probably put this down in a more business layer or encapsulate it at a lower level. But from SQL basically allows us to run a SQL string and it will create parameterized commands under the hood for us. And this is typically used if we want to wrap calling into views or calling into stored procedures. Importantly, from SQL, because we're going off of the coffee entity, as long as what we make sure what we return from the query returns something that's able to be put into a coffee object, it returns it as an iQueryable of coffee, and so we can just do order by descendings or take or skip logic, just normal link logic off of that. So in this case here, I'm just going to pass a search term into my from SQL. It can take a set of parameters that it will again parameterize as commands into these strings, into these format strings. So you wouldn't do string format here. You would actually let from SQL create it so that it creates those commands so that it's safer for us. Invalid offered object name, coffee. Okay. Let's just see what's going on here. So what I haven't done is to run the migrations. Create database. Coffee shop. Let me just try that again. Just make sure I've got the right program file here. Create database, new coffee context. We're creating it there, we're seeding it. Fingers crossed. I'm probably running, I'm running the wrong project. Queries demo. Okay, so I'll just go into Profiler, clear out what's there. Run our command. So basically what we did was we created the database, we seeded it with some data, then we ran our from SQL statement, we got back a coffee record, and what's run in SQL in Profiler. We can just see. Is select star from DB coffee where name like parameter, and that's an injected parameter into that statement. So that's using from SQL. And again, you'd use this to call into views, call into stored procedures, etc. Next demo I want to show is shadow state. Shadow state is a new entity framework concept where we can create shadow properties that live off of our entities. What I've done in this application is in our DB context. In model creating, I've told the model builder to look at the coffee entity and create a shadow property called last modified, which is of type date time. So this property is now queryable off of the object. It lives and is created as a column in the database table, but it doesn't, as I said, live on the class itself. So when we want to query it, we can use the EF property syntax. You'll see down here how I'm using this is, where this is useful, these shadow properties, is to implement things like auditing across your database. That's a good use case for something like this. So you can see here in our database context, I've overridden save changes. So this gets called anytime I make save changes across my application. I go to the change tracker, I detect changes, and I look for modifications in that entity type. Now, you could write this using a generic method to get it to happen right across your application. But what I'm looking for is added or modified entries off of the coffee. And what I'm going to then do is to go down into my shadow property and set the current time of the last modified to now. So it's a really nice, elegant way to implement something like auditing across your application. Up in my program, we're going to add a new coffee with a name. After we've seeded our data, we're going to add a new coffee record with the name of last added coffee, save changes. That should set the last modified date. Then we're going to run a query and order by last modified descending. So hopefully we'll see the one that we added at the top of the list because we're ordering by that shadow property. So just run that, come into Profiler, and kick that off again. Okay, there we go. Last added coffee is at the top of the list, ordered by our shadow property. Now, if we go to the database, we'll see that in the coffee table, we do in fact have a column last modified. And under the hood, like when we've created that query, I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it now. Yeah, it simply went off of that last modified column. That's where it's inserted it, sorry. So that's the shadow properties. Next one is to look at some of the changes in relational querying. Comment that out for a sec. So in my model, I've got a store object at the top of the hierarchy, and underneath that I've got trading days, which is a collection, and underneath that I've got customer orders, which is a collection, and then order, and then the coffees off of that. So I've got this hierarchical data set. And what I want to do when I run this query is to go to my store and get the first or default store record. And then down at the bottom, I'm going to print out the name of the store and the name of the first trading day for that. So when I run the query, that's the same query, apologies again. When I run that query, I get an inevitable error, which says trading days is a null object because I've only asked for the store object, so it can't then load up the trading days property. So what we've got in Entity Framework, as people are probably aware, is the include syntax, which allows us to include trading days, and then trading days won't be null when we go to query it. But what we've got, and what I want to talk about in Entity Framework 7, is a clearer syntax for how to get down to sub-properties off of our collection. So trading days is a collection, but what about if I want to get down to customer orders and then I want to print out the name of I want to include customer orders off of trading days. So I can't just do an include customer orders because trading days is an iCollection and it doesn't have a customer orders property. So what Entity Framework 7 gives us is the then include syntax, which allows us to keep including properties, complex properties, as we go down that hierarchy that come off of collections. If there was a second complex property off of the trading days collection, then I would have to re-include trading days and then include the other one as well, just to walk down that hierarchy. So that's a clearer syntax for what we used to do, which would be kind of putting select statements in the include, just to navigate that and force that to eager load properties further down the hierarchy. So if I run that again, we should see that we've included that trading days collection. Okay. The last query that I just want to show quickly is batching. And this relates to some of the performance improvements that are being built into EF7. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a new context, getting all the coffee entries as an array. I'm going to remove the first two coffee items from the array, make some changes to the third and fourth, and then I'm going to add a bunch of coffees. So if we run this through Profiler again, that's just creating all the database and inserting the seed data. If I run my query, just make sure I've included that, batching. Let's try that again. Okay, so it did run. So what we did a whole lot of individual statements, but if we work through what's actually happened in one batch to SQL, is that we've done our two deletes, first of all. So we've deleted the two coffees. There's a big long parameter list that's been sent in. We've then done our two updates. So we update coffee, set last modified, and the name. Again, the last modified's gone through our shadow state. And then we've done a bunch of inserts there. So it's been executed by Entity Framework as one batch, one unit of work. Now that's configurable off of the DB context. You can set the max batch size and play around with that. But I think that's a good improvement on Entity Framework there, that it's more performant that way. Okay. So that's some of the changes to querying. There are others. There's other performance-related queries where Entity Framework will look at really complex hierarchies, and it will actually send them off as, it'll break them up and send them off as separate commands and rebuild them together in memory if it works out that it can avoid having to do overly complex SQL. So that's a significant change as well in terms of what Entity Framework's trying to do to improve performance there. So So lots of subtle differences, new features such as batching and shadow state, which are new things that I think developers will take advantage of. Next thing I want to look at is migrations and just some of the scenarios around migrations and creating seed data. Again, as I said, this is an important thing to understand because of the life cycle of applications. It's not just development time, but it's also build, test, and deploy time. So we'll come across to our application again. So we've got a coffee store, our coffee store demo again. That's right. Set that as my startup project this time so that doesn't bite me. With our model of our coffee, and I've got an order, so it's a much simpler model that we're playing around with here. I've got my coffee store context object, which has got the two tables exposed off of it. And that's it. So what I'm going to do is to come in and again create my migrations. So I'll go out to the command line, dnx, ef, migrations, add, initial. And we get an error. Now, this error here is because in this example, I've moved my connection string out of my database context. So there's no override for on configuring here. I've actually gone to a more best practices approach and moved my connection string into configuration.json. But because this is a console application, the entity framework commands don't know how to configure up. It doesn't know to look in the config.json. If this was a web application, it would just work. It would read the startup code in my program. It would find the connection string in config, and it would work out what database I was talking to. Because I'm not, what I need to do is need to bring in a iDatabase context factory. Which the commands know to look for this interface in my program, and this interface needs to tell the commands how to connect to the database and where my database is. So in my implementation of iDatabase Contacts Factory, I'm saying it's for the coffee store context. I'm telling it where to get the connection string, and then I'm configuring entity framework using the entity framework extension, and then configuring the options to use SQL Server with that connection string. Okay, so now we should be able to go out and create our migrations. And hopefully it finds that interface, works out where the database is, and creates that migration for us. So in my program, previously you saw that I was using the database, delete database and create database, which under the hood also runs the migrations in the create database call. That's great for development time because you want all your developers to have the latest migrations. You want to make sure everyone's got the right database. You also want to make sure all your developers have got seeded data so they can be productive straight away. As your application grows, you won't want to blow away your database each time. You want a bit more fine-grained control over when you create your database and how migrations are applied as you build more migrations. So I've written a couple of extension methods here, one being ensure migrations applied. I'm hanging that as an extension method off of iService provider so that I can access it wherever I need it. I'm resolving my DB context, and then I've got another extension method called all migrations applied, which just runs down into some low-level EF infrastructure code and pulls out the history repository, the migrations assembly, works out which ones have been applied in that database, looks at the total and says, if there's any unapplied ones, just go and apply them for me. So you can put this in your developer config for your developers. then every time they run their app, you know you've got the latest database with all the migrations applied against it. Just go back to the program. So same with C data. I've just got another extension method here that says ensure development data. Again, in your test environment or on your build server, you might want to have another extension method which says ensure build data or ensure test data. We use this approach. I'll just show the implementation of that extension method. So again, we're just resolving it off of IaaS service provider, which means that we can then use IaaS service provider to get access to whatever services we want. I'm getting the coffee store context, and then I'm just going to go down and say if there's no coffee entries, obviously I haven't applied the data against this database, and I'm going to execute it. So again, we've used this in our testing environment quite a bit to make sure that our unit tests for a given service method, if we're injecting a repository, that we create data that unit test is going to require. So using an approach like this, you can write fine-grained unit tests and inject the data that you need really quickly and easily. So again, I'll just have to, because I'm not calling delete database, I'll have to come in and manually delete it, knowing that, and create it. So the database exists there so that the migrations can be applied against that. So that's all my database is just going to then run a search operation, which will run some SQL and find the coffees in our database, hopefully. So there we go. We created a new blank database. We used the migrations history repository. We applied those migrations against the database programmatically at runtime. We ensured that our development data existed, and then we ran a from SQL query off of that. So again, that developer, all they've done is pulled out of source control, bang, they're up and running, they're productive. Of course, in the real world, we would want to encapsulate this piece of ad hoc SQL into a service layer somewhere. And probably one such way that we would do that is to hang the find coffee method off of the context. So off of my interface here, all I've done is to push that SQL down into my coffee store context so that I can call it from elsewhere in my application. And now what I've done is to change that SQL into a stored procedure, and I'm calling the stored procedure in this from SQL method. So if I run that again, we wait to get our results, we get an error. This error is an expected one, and the reason that we got it is because I've changed from ad hoc SQL to a stored procedure. Entity Framework doesn't know about that stored procedure, so I need to add that to my migrations. The pattern that we are using for that is to use extension methods off of the migrations builder. And we've just got a bit of a naming convention in that we'll line up the name of the static void to be initial being the name of the migration, up being that we want to run this for the up operation, and then extension just so that we know that that's our custom extension. What I'm going to do is to come into the generated code, the EF command generated, and I'm going to place my initial up extension, which all that's going to do is to, let's bring that in. All that's going to do is to use the SQL operation class in Entity Framework to add this SQL as an operation for the migrations. So it's really important that we leverage this framework and we generate SQL, and I'll show you why in just a moment. I'll just come and also put in the down. It's also important the order in which you put these statements in. Obviously my creating the procedure is going to rely on the tables, and then I want to drop my procedure before I drop the tables. I am going to have to go back and clear out the database just so that I can rerun this migration and get this to take place. Otherwise, if I run this now, ensure migrations will say that migration already exists in the database. So I could have created a new migration for it. My approach, and I'm just going to do this how I would do it at work, is to put it in that generated file with the tables. Okay, so we've got our database, we've got our extension in our migration. Back in our program, we're now going to call into the stored procedure from here. Up at the top, we're going to ensure our migrations are applied. So fingers crossed. Hopefully the demo gods smile on us, and there we go. So that's gone through our stored procedure, so that's been migrated as part of that initial migration. I said that that is important to use that infrastructure. I'll just show you why that is. So if we're going to deploy, if we're going to go into a deployment environment, be that UAT or production, what we want to do generally is to create a static SQL script that's going to deploy our migrations and then get the DBAs to run those in their environment. To create that script, we can use Entity Framework migrations. Now I never remember this, so I'll just use help. Script is the command I'm after. Script, and then I'll just pipe that out to a deployment.sql. So you can pass in, after the word script, you can pass in an initial or a starting migration. So if you've got a whole list of migrations, you can say, I want to start at migration 5, and it will just generate the script from that point on. And what that's generated for us, again, if the gods are smiling, is our migrations now being bootstrapped into the generated migration, and we flow through with the SQL. So again, this is why it's important that if we're adding to migrations, we're not trying to do it in code, we're using the SQL operation, we're using the migration approach, and we're generating SQL in the up and down operations to conform to this approach so we're consistent. Just to wrap up, there's other lower level plumbing around migrations, like if you're going to go out and write a provider, like a database, your own database provider, you might be interested in the C# migration operation generator. It's basically a code generator wrapped around Entity Framework to help provider writers write strongly typed providers. The last thing I want to show is just the in-memory provider and just how that helps make testing much easier in Entity Framework. I'll switch back over to the demo box for that. So I've got a testing project in my solution. And within that, I've got an in-memory fixture, which is a test helper class that we've created. Again, we've leaned on the shoulders of giants. This is the same kind of code that we've found in the Entity Framework test repositories on GitHub. So what this does is we just new up a service collection and we add Entity Framework. So we're configuring dependency injection within the DI framework of vNext. Instead of adding a SQL provider, we're now adding an in-memory database. And then the rest of the configuration is similar. we tell the options when it's creating that database context to use the in-memory database. So we don't need to give it a SQL connection string because it's all going to happen in memory. Down the bottom, I've just added some dependency injection code to help me resolve my context as an interface. And then I've written a price service, which is just another class in my domain logic to help mark up prices of coffees. And I'm going to resolve that as an iPrice service. If we look at the project JSON for the testing project, you can see my dependencies look a bit different. So I've now only got 2 entity framework dependencies. I don't need commands because I'm not generating migrations because it's all happening in memory. And I don't need SQL Server, but instead I've brought in the in-memory provider. I've brought in XUnit, which is a lightweight testing framework. This is the testing framework that's being used across the VNex stable. And I've brought in the XUnit runner, which is the DNX commands, similar to the EF commands, but this is like the DNX commands to run XUnit. And I've brought in EF7 demo.coffeestore, which is our project that we want to test. I've added a command called test, which will run the XUnit test runner. So I've got a couple of fixtures here. One is just to test my price service. It should mark up all prices. So I'm going to resolve my coffee store context. I'm going to only so that I can ensure my test data. Then I'm going to resolve my iPrice service, get my calculator. In my act, I'm going to update all my prices by 10%, and then I'm going to do my assertions. I've got another test there which tests a lower level method and just uses a theory and passes in 3 data sets, and it will just run that test for each of the inline datas on that theory. I don't have XUnit up and running. There are Visual Studio extensions to detect the tests and run them in Visual Studio. They're not working against the build of the framework that I've got. So again, I'll just go out to the command line and run my DNX test command. Hopefully that will fire up XUnit. XUnit will detect my tests, my 2 tests and my 3 theories ran successfully on that occasion. So that's tested our whole stack, our database context, our price service, which injects our database context. We've tested all that logic with in-memory data using an in-memory provider. We don't need the SQL Server. So this is what we're now running on our build server, and we're failing builds on that. So I think it just makes unit testing your service logic that depends on your repositories much easier. And again, this is part of what I was talking about around enjoyability and productivity, is that if I can do this really quickly and get up and running, then I'm more likely to write unit tests. Okay, so that wraps up my presentation today. I apologise for all the stammering early on, obviously some early morning nerves, but hopefully what's come through in my talk is really a framework that you're motivated to think, I want to pick that up because I can do a lot and be productive with it. And I hope I've also shown that it's not a hard thing to get up and running by just injecting these 3 packages into your projects. So thanks for your time this morning. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take some now, or you can catch me afterwards. Thanks. Database first scenarios? Yeah, so the question there is around database first scenarios versus code first scenarios. That is one of the features that I believe that they will work on after the first go live at the end of Q1 next year. I couldn't tell you what the version number will be, but I do know that it is on the backlog. And you could go and have part of that conversation on. I'd encourage you to ask that question in the issues list. I know that they're very active and you would get an answer to that question. Yep. So the question there is around when we're developing, do we turn the migrations on or off, say through, yeah. So I think like the approach that I showed here, like there's a number of approaches that you can take. You can blow away the database using database delete and recreate, or you can write that lower level logic that I had and write an extension method that will just look and apply migrations that haven't been applied. I think that's more like what I would put into a development startup configuration on a developer. While we were developing, I'd put that in my startup logic under a development configuration to just say go and apply any updates that haven't been applied or any migrations that haven't been applied. But I'd bake that into my configuration just to make it easier for developers to be always running the latest database. If they want to turn it off, they can go and comment it out. But yeah, I mean, I'd be inclined to put that in source code and just keep everyone up to date.
How would you go about using the in-memory database to unit test that stored procedure?
That's a good question. That's one I haven't tackled yet, but I was thinking about that as I was writing my demo this morning. No, you wouldn't. That's right. You wouldn't be able to support the from SQL stuff.
So if you have stored procedures, does that mean you can't use it at all, basically?
Not using that approach. That's correct. Yeah.
You can still run a unit test off the SQL provider if you had a test, spin up a test database, seed that data in the same approach, but just use SQL instead.
Yeah. Yeah, you'd have to find some way to just bypass the sprock. Yeah.
With the relationships or dependencies and bringing in child tables and children.
Like the includes and the then includes?
Yeah. What does the SQL look like? Does it do 3 queries or does it do some sort of weird merging distinct thing?
Yeah, so the question around like when we've got includes and then includes is what SQL gets generated. So there's new smarter logic. I forget the exact product name that they gave it, but I think it's called smart queries. And what Entity Framework will do is it will look at the query expression that gets built and it will say, I know a bit about this, and it will actually pull them out into different statements if it can and just generate simpler, like select this from that table, and it will then do stuff in memory to build up a result set. So it might execute 3 queries instead of building a really big, obtuse, left-right join monster. It might execute 3 simple queries and then do stuff in memory to build the result set. And so that's a performance optimization called smart queries, I think.
I don't want to be greedy. I've got another question. The configuration of like custom keys and stuff when you're setting up your code first models, is there something out of the box for attributes instead of putting them in code?
Yeah, so you've still got the same around configuration of Entity Framework behavior. You've still got the same. You can use the attribute data annotations model or the Fluent APIs. So that's pretty much the same as Entity Framework 6 with some minor adjustments and tweaks. So you can take the convention based, when you veer from the conventions, you can use attributes or Fluent to kind of stamp that out.
When generating your migrations, you didn't need a target database for that?
When I generated my migrations,
Like outputting the SQL for your deployments and so on.
so that's all read in through the configuration, and that's why I needed to have that iDatabase context factory to tell the migrations command what the target database was. But I can also then pass in the name of the migration that I want to start from. So rather than the migration, the command looking at the database and saying, well, I know these are all in there, if I'm creating my deployment SQL script, I would tell it which migration step to start from, and that's just a part of the command.
I was just wondering if it generated all that SQL without needing a spun up database to, run against, because currently I'm using Fluent Migrator, and generally you run it against an instance and output the SQL, and usually it'd tell you if there are errors or anything by running it without.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so that feature is not going to be in the initial release, but it's going to be one of the backlog features to do that more of that reverse engineering from an existing database logic. So that will come with that sort of logic, I believe. Okay. I'm happy to. We can play around with that outside if you want. I'm happy to happy to run a few. I'm keen. Yeah, I'm keen to explore that stuff. So, yeah.
I believe there's no dependency, from what I understand. But when you do like a database update command or other commands around that, that's when you will have to have a database. So it will fail in some instances, but it won't fail in others. Yep. So each of those migrations contains its own snapshot of what the database should look like. So it then can work it out basically based on where it thinks it is in the in the chain. Yep.
Sorry.
Yeah.
In past versions of Enemy Framework, as you started to have lots and lots of models, lots of relationships, performance would go down. Is that the case in EF7? I think you mentioned 200 tables.
We're running 200
relationships.
tables,
Mm.
and we're running like in-memory tests, etc., and they only take a couple of milliseconds.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, like we had
He loves it.
we had a tight delivery last week or over the weekend actually for a whole lot of service endpoints. We smashed them out over the weekend. We had to deliver them to the customer on Monday, and so we quickly then went over and switched the in-memory provider, wrote a bunch of unit tests against them. They all went green. We shipped. So yeah, both the in-memory, the SQL, the performance seems fine. I think it's 220 tables that we're running off.
It's probably about 1,000 relationships in total, which we've actually configured using that Fluent API tool.
Cool. Yeah. So I'll take that question.
Mapping to a domain layer, how has that improved with it? Like previously, we needed to, domain layer, you have to have virtual properties and then maps.
Yeah.
Has there been an improvement in them as people drive it?
I don't know if there's been an improvement yet. Like a lot of the design stuff's kind of out of the way at the moment. I know that previously you had to use virtual and iCollections like that. That all goes now. Like you just create public list of whatever. So some of the incantations you had to put in your code have gone. So it's a bit cleaner that way, I suspect. But yeah, I haven't played around with that stuff enough to know whether it's better or worse. Yeah, sorry.
On the subject of those SQL scripts that are generated, say somebody did write a provider for Oracle or whatever, does that SQL generation run through the provider so you could generate a script that is specific for a database? Yep.
That's right. Yeah, so that's when you would use that lower level provider class. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, the question is regarding any second level caching support in the EF7. Would there be any, or I'm not sure of any support available as of now.
There is no lazy loading, so
That's
at this
right.
stage, and from what I understand of looking at the source code, there is no cache enabled either.
So would that be in future final release or not?
We couldn't tell you that. We would have to look at the design meeting notes to see
Yeah.
if cache's on their radar.
And again, I'd throw that as a question into the issue list. Like they respond within hours typically. Like they're very active on there. Yep. Yeah, no worries. Cool. Thanks very much. Yeah.
Not sure if you could say general question, not version 7, just general interest framework question. Not sure if I can ask that one. But anyway, I'll try.
Thanks very much, guys.
Studio,
Thanks.